Okay, I think we're just about to get the number of participants just joining, and I think we'll start right now. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us to this nice webinar. I don't know where you are right now. You might be under 6 feet of snow or just under hail or on the sunny beach in Australia, but anywhere, wherever you are, thank you for joining us. Always organizing a webinar is a hard time to set the time for everyone to enjoy, but hopefully we're getting a good turn of people from all over the world. So I'm really excited for you to join this webinar. This evening, we had several webinars in the past. This evening we have a really amazing guy, Jeff Singh. He's the QA manager of Iterable. Am I saying it correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Right, in Silicon Valley. A really great guy. I had a lot of conversations with him. Learning a lot about his experience and his insights. So hopefully you guys will enjoy the conversation as much as I have. We'll start with a very short introduction of Cloudbeat, our host. I'm VP product of Cloudbeat, and then move straight along to the presentation itself. I'll leave Jeff to explain the topics and everything. So we'll just start with a very short presentation, just explaining a bit about what Cloudbeat is to whomever's very curious about that. Let me just share my screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Cool, great. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm not going to go through a full presentation since we don't really have time. I'll just explain what Cloudbeat really is about. And Cloudbeat is a software testing and performance monitoring, orchestration, and synthetic monitoring tool. Basically, all-around tool to give you, and maybe during the presentation we might have a few words on that. But really processing the entire process of taking the entire process of test automation, the SDLC of test automation, from the stage of planning it, coding, testing, and then of course deploying it and doing some sort of monitoring. When I say synthetic monitoring, I mean real user experience, user experience in production. That's what we do. We do it through two mechanisms, and we'll talk about them. The one is we have a framework called Oxygen, which is a software testing based on JavaScript, and that enables you to create test automation for web, mobile, API, desktop applications, and other types of test automation. And that's the Oxygen solution. So, and by the way, it's open source, so completely open source. It's really a celebrated tool, a lot of workshops, a lot of articles about it. So I really recommend you guys try it out. It's oxygenhq.org. It's an open source project. You can either just download it as a CLI for your CI/CD processes, or you can actually use it as an IDE tool for recording test automation, and that's really an amazing tool for you to use if you need it. The other product is our test orchestration platform, which really takes all your test automation, not only Oxygen, but any other test automation, and it connects it to your CI/CD process, connects to your test lab, either internal test labs or any other external labs like Source Labs, Genymotion, BrowserStack, and others. Finally, getting you with good analytics, because when you want to do 50 test cases running on 5 devices, let's say on 10 devices, 50 test cases on 10 devices, you don't want to get 500 reports. You want to get one single report. So this is the analytics part. And then you can really get fast to CI/CD decisions of what you want to do and if you want to push this version forward. So basically what Cloudbeat does, it provides you a full orchestration platform to take all your test automation to the next level and really scale it up to run with hundreds of test cases or thousands of test cases. Previous webinar, we had it with Ronak Ray from Forbes magazine, and they run 20,000 test cases. So certainly that's a challenge, and certainly an orchestration platform would be something that you'd consider. But even if you just have 100 or 200 test cases, it's already hard to manage them without an orchestration platform. So this is a bit about Cloudbeat. I don't want to talk too much about us, really just combining all the tools together, just adding all the test automation, and that's about it. That's on my side. If you have any questions or you want to ask any questions or anything, feel free to ask in the Q&A and I'll be glad to answer them. You can contact me and I'll give you my email in the end of the conversation. You can contact me, email around .damnin@cloudbeat.io or through the social media or through LinkedIn, and we'll talk about that in a later stage. Okay, that's my side of the things. Just saying thank you all for joining us. I'm sure you'll have a great time as much as I had with Jeff. Jeff, just feel free to talk to the people if they have any questions. I'll be shooting questions. Other than that, I think the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Haran.
Okay, now
let me share my screen.
Yeah, I need to actually move you to be. Do you have the hosting capabilities? Let me see.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can. We can.
All right. Well, in that case, let's get started. So good morning or good afternoon to you over on the other side, or good, evening. I think in Israel it's already night. My name is Jeff. I'm currently leading the quality program at Iterable. Iterable is located in the Bay Area, as Haran mentioned. We are a cross-channel marketing platform. Basically, we help our brands engage with their customers across their digital journey. So everything from SMS to email to in-app. So what is my QA journey like? Well, I've been in QA for about 15 years. Industries like web security, medical tech, MarTech. I've done everything from manual testing, automation, architecting, to recently leading QA teams and leading QA engineers. And throughout my journey in QA, I've gotten asked a lot of questions from people like my boss, other engineers, my directs, or people who want to get into QA. And I feel like, engineers in QA, we all get these same questions, right? We get questions like, what is the best way our team should do this for quality? Or I heard this company does this, so why don't we implement that? Or even, hey, I'm trying to get into QA. Should I learn this language? Should I learn this tool, right? What should I pick up? Or if you go to a lot of conferences or a lot of webinars, you'll hear people present saying, if you want to be successful in QA, you need to implement this. This is the best practice that you need to do, right? So what is this best practice, right? I consider our community as QA leaders. And as QA leaders, we need to think about this. How do we set up our teams for success? How do we build QA, right? What's that one strategy? And the thing is, what I realized in this last 15 years is there's not always one strategy, right? And this kind of brings me to today's talk, the Morphing QA, right? What I've discovered is different companies at different stages need different strategies. When you're a small company with only maybe 5 engineers, the goal of your quality engineering program or your definition of quality will look very, very different as you scale upwards, right? By the time you get to a enterprise level with $1 million contracts, and millions and millions of events a day, your quality will look completely different. The whole thing though is what got you to each stage may not get you to the next stage, right? So you need to understand the programs that you need to build at each stage, how to scale forward, what you should be preparing for, and what you need to leave behind. And hence the title, the Morphing QA. So what is our agenda today? I plan to talk a bit about what is a modern quality engineering program. It's good to kind of understand baseline, what a good program looks like, what you should be thinking about if you're building a QA team, or if you have a QA team, make sure that you're doing these things. And then let's jump into the story, right? We'll start in the bottom left, our garage seed stage, right? These are small companies that are getting up. And then we'll move to our early stage maturing, right? These are our Series A, Series B. You have some success, you're making money, you have a big logo. Then to our Series C's and D's, are fully commercial, looking for an exit. And finally, our enterprise level, right? Companies that are, public. So what is a modern quality engineering program? I like to define it by 4 tenets, right? The first one is pretty obvious, robust testing, right? This is the orchestration of testing across your entire pyramid, right? Testing pyramid, right? Your unit testing, your component integration, your end-to-end, and your manual on top, right? Robust testing means that you have high feature coverage across the entire test pyramid, that you have the right tools in each area. On the flip side is what I call quality assurance. And quality assurance is our, defined quality related processes that you're engaging in, right? And you use these processes during the development lifecycle. These could be your test strategy, test plan, validation checklist. But the difference is robust testing is kind of saying, hey, how do I make sure I didn't release any bugs? And quality assurance is more like, how do I make sure I didn't build in any bugs in the process? And we kind of tie these two together through this third principle, which I like to call quality control, which is the evaluation of quality of what we're building to ensure it meets our customer expectation. These are our metrics, our KPIs. This is how we can look at quality holistically and say, are we doing well? Are we catching bugs? Are we preventing bugs? If not, how do we trace back to improve this system? And finally, I think one of the most important things is from these three, a modern quality engineering program should be building partnerships, right? How is your engineering process? How are you representing engineering to go to market, to customer service, to design, to product security? How do you support these teams? How do you help engineering prove out your quality that these people can use it to engage with their customers? All right, so before we start, a few disclaimers. I'm going to be talking about a few stories about companies and generalizing. Obviously, not all companies operate the same way, right? Different fields require different strategies. And I'm sure people on this call today, on this webinar, represent different industries. And obviously, when I generalize, you may think, well, no, that doesn't make sense. Our company doesn't do that. That'll never work. What I want you to realize is different fields have different customers, right? So for example, if I'm a SaaS company that does developer tools versus I'm a medical tech company, the SaaS company, I can make mistakes, right? The worst is an outage, I might churn someone. Whereas a medical tech device company, you could potentially kill someone, right? So the standards are going to be different and the rule sets are going to be different. But the one thing that ties every single company together in quality is the definition of success, and that's our customer evaluation, right? It doesn't matter where you are. If you are serving your customer correctly and they are happy, then you have brought good quality, right? And I want you to remember that it's not about how many test cases pass. It's not about how many tests you run. It's not about how smart your automation system is, right? The end goal for quality is your customer happy? And how do you drive that? So let's dive in. Our first stage, I like to joke about it and call it WFG, work from garage, but really it's probably work from WeWork. But now that COVID's here, it may really be back to work from garage. These companies are the ones where you have one or two founders that got to know each other, maybe got some funding, maybe won an award, and now are proofing out a concept. So let's talk some real companies. The first one I want to bring up is called CareerCraft. CareerCraft has 3 employees. They were founded in 2020, and they help school district plan and implement college career and military readiness program. The founders are veterans of the Texas education system. So I consulted with this company to help them do some quality RFAs, and I know the CTO. So they have 1 engineer. Experiment Engine has 5 employees. I know their founders. 2 of them are engineers. They were founded in 2014. The company is a platform to manage and source experiments. Founders were selected for the prestigious Techstar Austin program, so they had a really great product. They competed and they got some funding. Eventually, they were acquired by Optimizely in 2017. So from stories I'm going to tell about these two companies, a lot of the themes are very similar. And that's kind of where, talking to other founders from different companies, I'm going to tie together these themes. So what is the biggest theme, right? The biggest theme is this is the challenge that every single small startup faces, right? It's this classic good, fast, cheap. You only get to pick 2, right? And when you're such a small startup, literally 5 people, you can't even really afford to sit in the WeWork yet, right? Everything's going to have to be cheap because you have limited resources. So the thing about it is when you're an early stage startup, you're still figuring out your product market fit. And it's necessary sometimes to build really, really fast instead of really, really good. Because what good is a new feature if nobody's going to get any value out of it? So let's talk about some testing challenges at this early stage, right? What is your product market fit? It's hard to talk about quality when you don't even know what you're building. And this is really true, right? Almost all of these companies that I talk to or work with, they're still sitting in with customers and saying, hey, look, let me just give you my product for free. I just want to see how you use it. I know the problem statement. I know how I want to get you there, but I don't really know how to engage you. And I don't really know that product market fit. It's really hard to test against that. What are you even testing, right? You're still figuring out the market needs and who can actually test. This is a big one. Talking to all my friends that are in startups, every moment that you're working on writing some automation is basically time you're not, releasing code. And most of the times, the people who are testing are your salespeople, your founder who doesn't code, right? Your chief of marketing. Those are the people who are actually testing. So what are some best practice considerations for someone at a seed stage? Well, do your best to understand your customer's critical use case and focus on testing this, right? So if I'm going to say, I'm the engineer, my friend's the marketer, hey, when you test, please test, the critical use cases. For me as an engineer, make sure the critical infrastructure or architecture mistakes don't doom me, right? And what does this mean? So I have a great example. I was reading the news. If you haven't heard, Parler is an American company that, it's a social media company that allows people to post, community rooms, kind of like a Reddit. And recently, they helped, a lot of people who were part of the Capitol Hill riots in January were on it. And they made a huge, huge infrastructure mistake, right? Their public APIs use no authentication. And when they deleted their post, when customers deleted their post, the site didn't actually delete the content. It just added a flag to it. So hackers were able to go into Parler. They were able to create scripts to scrape every single post, even deleted ones, and tie it back to users, right? This is a critical infrastructure mistake. They made a huge mistake on how they architected this. And now it's like, will people ever trust them again? Would you ever go back, right? This is pretty big data loss. They can get sued for this. So next thing I want to talk about is automation goes. When you're at such a small stage, should you even automate? What makes sense, right? Why would you even write automation code when you should be building features, right? The more time you spend writing automate tests for something like UI, is less time you're spending time learning what your market needs and building the right features. So, your UI may change so rapidly, it doesn't even make sense to kind of write automation against it. On the other hand, if you have services like, APIs that your customers depend on, and this is the base of what you're selling, it's easier than manual testing to write automation for those. So in that case, yes, you should. So scaling architecture, right? Smart architectural decisions made now will help you scale in the future, right? If you kind of put in a little effort saying, hey, I know where I want to go, this is our base, spend the time to build that well, and it'll serve you well later on, rather than coming back and having to fix it. And drive culture. I think this is probably one of the most important things that I've seen out of all our founders. So currently at Iterable, our founder is still here. He's the one that, sat in his apartment with his friends writing Iterable. And he has this huge culture of customer first, customer quality. And 7 to 8 years later, our company has grown so much, but that culture still thrives in engineering. It's that accountability, that drive to make sure that we're serving our customer well, that need for quality, right? That culture will scale. On the other hand, I've been at small companies where, it's, the culture was very much, let's make the money, let's get it out fast, who cares, right? And that prevails inside the engineering culture. And you'll see things like, well, that's not my problem. I don't have to deal with it, right? Why should I take care of that? I'm doing this. Cool. Let's move on to our next stage. This is our series A/B, right? You're no longer in the WeWork. Congratulations. You actually have enough people to get, an office, right? You're taking off. You probably have one big logo that's using you and that's giving you 40% of your, revenue, but they're paying you. So here are some company stories. iOvation. iOvation is located in Portland. It has about 75 to 150 employees, about 30 engineers, and about 5 QA, which is, different. Most companies of these size do not have QA just because they just can't afford it. They don't have the resources for it. iOvation, though, is a financial tech company founded in 2014, right? They provide online businesses and customers with device-based authentication used to prevent fraud and risk prevention. So in some sense, they needed that QA because of the financial, quality, right? They need to make sure that they don't release things badly because they can't. If they do, they're in trouble. They can lose inside their contracts with customers. they could potentially lose business. So the founders were originally building tech for the gaming industry, specifically poker, and they were acquired by TransUnion in 2018. Now, Rollbar, I actually never worked for, but I consult with some of their managers, and I've helped them a bit. They have 50 to 100 employees. They're based in the Bay Area. Engineering is about 40 people, and they have no QA. This is more standard of what I see in the Bay Area of this company of this size, right? They're founded in 2012. They're a developer tool that uses AI and ML to discover, predict, and remediate errors. So what are the biggest challenges for companies of this size? Well, the velocity is so high. There's so much going on, right? It's ship, right? So it's really hard to do anything, right? Internal tools almost takes a back seat to getting code out to customers, because at the end of the day, if you do not ship, you die, right? So what are the testing challenges then? Who's driving product development? For iOvation, I think when I left, we just got a product manager, right? So it used to be the CEO is driving product, right? Or maybe the customers are driving product development, right? And when you're driving product development, not from top down, but from what we call catapult, right? Like, hey, I want this. Okay, let's build it. That does affect quality, because you don't technically have time to figure out what to build, right? Why am I testing this? What is the reason, right? It's kind of, well, the customer wants this, but then how do we make sure we actually built it correctly? Majority of all the incidents that happen at Rollbar or at iOvation were not caused by code changes. They were not caused by developers making a mistake. They were caused because of DevOps, right? When you built your tool, right? Originally, you're thinking, oh, I have 5 customers with, this many events coming in. So the system, the way, interacts with the services in the back, or the way, talks to your data store, talks to each other, works. But suddenly, you're successful, your product works, and you get 50 times the amount of traffic, right? Now you have serious performance issues, or you have serious instability issues, right? How you hacked it update before no longer works anymore. You're also small and fast. So there is no time for formal test cases or formalized process, right? And there's a danger there, right? Because you're moving at a speed of good enough to release, right? There is no, do we hit a checkpoint where we feel comfortable? It's the product's there, let's go. And standards, what are your standards, right? And I found that usually the standards, or how cross-functional teams work together, basically was how much they liked each other, right? If they liked each other, we're going to work fine. If they don't like each other, the teams don't talk, right? And the formalized tools or processes that they even had was more of, whoever was the architect or staff engineer championed the tool from the last company he worked at, and everyone just used that tool. So best practice considerations, right? Who owns quality? Well, in this case, the hint I would say is engineering, right? Everyone should own quality, because there is no quality team. But you should have a quality champion, right? And a quality champion should be someone that, is a staff engineer or manager. I rarely see, head of engineering, like a VP or director as a quality champion, because they have so much other things to worry about. But your quality champion should really be pushing, accountability, right? Process, right? Like, how do we code review, right? How do we start building in things that as new engineers come on board, that they know what to do, right? If I'm a new engineer and it's not immediately apparent that when I deploy code or ship code, I have to get code reviewed, I have to write unit tests, I have to contribute to some framework to do some testing, I'm not going to do it. And what I find works really well are guilds, right? This is what, iOvation and Rollbar has done, right? And what a guild is, and I use the Spotify example, is an interest group that anyone can join. It's a cross-functional group, right? Any engineers that are interested in front end, back end, or testing joins this guild. And here they draft the policy. They come up with the best practices. They show off the tooling they build. So one team in one squad or one scrum might say, hey, we use, say, Cypress, or we use this tooling. And the engineers on another team might be like, oh, that's perfect. I learned this at this guild. Let's bring it over. And this is how you cross-functionally share things. Now, build versus buy. I think this is actually one of the most important conversations that we're not really talking about in the quality industry. Why buy might be better than build. From the last 4 companies I've had, I've seen a lot of, hey, we are going to build our own Selenium automation product, right? We're going to have a staff engineer not work on code, but build this. Or we'll have our QA engineer build this and everyone use it. And the problem about building your frameworks is that you have to build bespoke, right? You need to build your own tooling. You need to build your wrappers around your code. You need to build the integration with your CI/CD system, and you need to build, metrics. How do you actually tell if this is running well or not, right? And if you aren't in, the business of building tools, and your product isn't that complicated, right? And you don't need that specific, it may be cheaper. It probably is always cheaper to have a solution than a dedicated engineer to build it. And why is that, right? Well, like I said, if you aren't in the business of building testing frameworks, you're going to miss out on tons of features out of the box, right? Iran kind of just talked about CloudBeat and all the features you get, right? Look at that. If you invest in a tooling, everything I mentioned, right? Your test management, your test suite, Oxygen kind of handles a lot of these for you, right? Like your IDEs, your wrappers around your current code, right? The integrations, right? The orchestration for CI/CD, right? How do you automatically get picked up? How does it automatically run? Your build systems, talking to something like, say, a Sauce Lab or Browser Stack, so you can do testing across multiple browsers, right? Reporting, all of that is handled for you. You don't need to spend engineering time to figure out that, right? And you don't have to deal with a bespoke framework that needs tons of maintenance. And this is huge, right? Stories, iOvation, we had an engineer spend quarters building out, a Selenium using Cucumber integration. And it kept breaking, kept being flaky, right? As things changed, tooling changed, the open source libraries changed, it broke, right? But when you buy a tool, a vendor, they are growing with you. And their team is figuring out how to improve these things so that your framework doesn't need to be maintained. You just need to integrate correctly with them. And that's something that you really should be thinking about. Also, early adoption is generally easier. You don't have to rip out an old framework. You can just build on top, right? You don't have to figure out how to pull plugs out of your CI/CD system. You just have to figure out how to step with it. And the beauty of this is, what we found is the companies that we bought vendors in, so Cypress is my example, we've used it the last 2 shops, is they grow with you, right? What does that mean? That means that as you grow as a company and your use cases grow, they will provide you those tooling, because you're the customer and they're building things for you. So as you be more successful, they can be more successful with you. They'll scale with you. So let's talk a bit about Cypress, because every company that I've been to has replaced Selenium with Cypress so far. And why is that, right? Everything I talked about, let's kind of look at this from, A versus B, right? We did kind of a bake-off between Cypress and Selenium. We had our team use our current Selenium framework versus Cypress we were in touch, right? And we asked which one's easier to set up test. And that was Cypress, right? It was easier to set up tests, it's easier to write, right? And why? We have things like automatic waits built in. We don't have to write it ourselves. And we have a lot of tooling around SPI, stubs, network, traffic control, which we don't need to find the open source libraries for. It's so much easier to run your tests. It's easier to debug your tests because you have videos, you have logging. The UI is stronger, and outside the box, it automatically builds logging for you. So you don't have to create your own logging system. You don't have to figure that out. And one of the most important I mentioned is your CI/CD, right? Cypress, if you look at the picture here, it does parallelization for you, right? You tell it how many instances that you have that you want to run tests on, and it will accurately compute which tests should be put into parallel and run them. And you'll save a lot of time, right? I think our Selenium used to take us 1 hour, 30 minutes. Cypress without parallelization took us about the same, but with parallelization, it took us about 25 minutes, which is a huge factor. So let's talk a bit about automation goals, right? At this stage, it's really about the uncomfortable trade-offs. A lot of the things that I'm going to talk about in this slide is the trade-offs between developer work in progress versus testing, right? what should developers be doing versus what should they be testing? And we're coming from this from the perspective that you haven't established QA yet, right? So hard stop, developers need to write unit tests, right? I don't care how small your organization is. If you don't have unit tests, you're in trouble. You need to have that culture of getting them to do it. But end-to-end automation tests, I can see where, someone might say, nope, we don't have time to write it. We just can't. We love to, but we can't, right? Because at the end of the day, you're trading off feature coverage for release velocity, right? You have to get this code out, right? So your focus should really be on testing things that this can't break, right? Absolutely. If I have 50 features, which one cannot break? This is the one I'm testing, right? You're really moving to this concept of risk-based feature coverage rather than feature-based coverage, right? And when you look at automation, right? When you're small, you need to think of everything as sustainable, right? Will this code be maintainable and more resilient towards error in the future? That's what we're checking, rather than will this code break the application, right? It seems similar, but the biggest thing is I want to check that this code, will not potentially break later on in regression stage. And how do we kind of intelligently test that, right? Because if you write automation very quickly just on certs and it becomes flaky, right? No one's going to fix your flaky test. It's very, very hard to pull, engineers off work, and they have tons of technical debt, tons of defects they have to fix, tons of other things. They're not going to fix your flaky tests, and your flaky test is going to sit there. Finally, a lot of what I see, is kind of DevOpsy work, right? Instead of testing, can we cheat by smarter deployment orchestration? What does this mean? Can we catch things in production before our customers, right? It's kind of the concept of, if, a tree falls in Siberia and no one hears it, did it really fall, right? You can use things like feature flags or robust monitoring. And if you could say, oh, this is broken in production before any customers see it and bring it back, right? You can almost kind of cheat and not test certain things because you're watching it really closely. So how do you scale for the future? Mature process, right? Ambiguity on how to do things is bad. You're a hyper growth phase, right? Usually if you get series B, you're doing really well. So you're about to move forward, right? And you want to set up your engineers that are coming in for success, right? So make sure you remove ambiguity on how to do things, right? Hey, how do we, when you come in, you check in code, what are you supposed to do, right? How does your DevOps system work, right? How do you move from point A to point B to point C in your job without breaking things, right? If you get rid of these little things by having a mature process and building it out, it will serve you well later on when you're ready to, add in a QA team, add in a product team. Total quality ownership, right? I kind of touched on this, right? You need to make sure everyone owns quality, not just one team, right? And if you build expectations early, such as, hey, you need to have code coverage, right? You need to have unit test coverage, right? It will serve you well later down on the road. All right, moving into the series C and D. This is actually my favorite stage, earn the right to go public. So company stories, both Optimizely and Iterable are in San Francisco. I worked at them both. Optimizely had 250 to 500 employees, about 120 engineers, and about 6 QA engineers. They were founded in 2009. They're an experimentation platform and progressive delivery tooling, so developer tools and marketing tools. The founders introduced this technology during Obama's initial presidential run. They basically introduced A/B experimentation for fundraising, and Obama did amazing with that, right? And amazing enough that they took this tool and they sold it to a lot of people. And they were acquired by Episerver in 2020. Iterable has about same 205 to 500 employees. Engineering, we have about 70 engineers, and we have about 2 QA, so we're growing. We were founded in 2013 as a growth marketing platform that allows brands to engage with their customers. And then a funny story is the founders met at a house party in SF and basically built Iterable inside a 1-bedroom apartment, so not even a garage. So what are the challenges for C's and D's, right? Well, before, it's move fast, break things, right? Hey, let's go. We drive so much value to our customers. We're constantly bringing new features, and yes, sometimes things break, but we fix them fast. They love us. We're good value. We're going to help them win. Buy us, we'll help you win. Great. made a ton of money, right? Suddenly, big logos are buying you, right? We want you. Here's $1 million. Great, we're enterprise customers. Your CMO, your CFOs. Hey, look at how many big logos are on our webpage. But what do these big logos want? They want stability, right? They're paying you enterprise prices. They expect enterprise experience, but they still expect you to move fast. So now it's no longer move fast and break things, because you can't break things. You have to move fast with stable infrastructure, right? That means your quality has to be good. You cannot go down for things like performance. You cannot go down for random incidents. You cannot have ticky-tacky bugs anymore. If something breaks, you have to be able to explain why you didn't catch it, why was your validation off. So testing challenges. Growth brings changes. Usually I see in these stages, these are the kind of big things that I'm seeing, right? Your culture is changing. Teams are maturing, right? You actually now have a head of product, right? Your design team has started. You have a security team now. And finally, you have a QA team, right? This is generally when QA starts, right? And these teams are all infant and they need to figure out how to work together. Regretted attrition, right? At this stage, you probably lost some of your engineers that joined really, really early on, right? You maybe only have a handful left. And losing those engineers means you lose a lot of institutional knowledge, right? At Optimizely, one of our engineers left and no one knew how to run the automation framework he built, right? Also kind of why we ended up going to Cypress. And you're doing well. You're probably best in your industry now, right? You're chasing the big dogs, right? That means that hackers want to come after you. So now you need to start thinking about things like security, right? Vulnerability management. And you're big enough that you have, a CMO, a CFO, and they're going to talk to customers. And if your quality isn't bad and they have bugs, they might call them, say, hey, you're the chief of, customer success. Why is our product so bad? My engineers or my marketers say this is no good, right? I'm not happy. And they're in turn going to call your boss, the VP of engineering, maybe a director of engineering, and say, why is our quality so bad? I'm going to talk to the CEO about this, right? And your boss is going to look to you and say, what is our feature quality? How do we quantify this? Are we doing good? Are we doing bad? Is our testing working? And you as a quality leader need to be able to answer these questions. And how do you do that? So best practice considerations. Generally speaking, this is where I see QA grow, right? From talking to other companies, from working at these two companies, from seeing, who's hiring. Most companies at this stage are answering these questions I mentioned before in the last slide and saying, crap, we need a formalized QA team. And this is kind of where you start. So what does this look like? This could be like, what Iterable is doing, starting a QA team, hiring QA engineers, or it could be like a QA coaching team, right? Build a QA coaching team. It's a group of, staff level QA engineers who kind of coach. You go to them, they coach you, and kind of help you out. Or you might have a QA lead, right? For example, Nextdoor has one QA engineer, or they're hiring another one, but that's their QA lead. And you go to that one person for consultation from everything from process to automation techniques, and they're not really there to do hands-on. They're really there to consult. Here's a great time as a QA when you're starting to introduce test plans and test strategy, right? Now is the time to start building out strategy over how we test, how we work with engineering, product, and other teams, right? On the other side, this is not where you dive in. You're too small, right? Everything we talk about, when you start, the first thing you don't want to do is saying, hey, I'm going to manual test and exploratory test, even though you do need to do some of that. And that's where community testing comes in, right? So for Iterable and at Optimizely, we have stuff like bug bashes and exploratory testing program, right? We partner up with developers, we create rotations, and we manual test this way. QA leadership is also super important at this point, right? I like to start something called a testing cabal, right? Which I get together, a security engineer, a performance engineer, the head of design and the head of docs. Docs being most small companies, the people writing the docs are the people testing, right? And we sit together and we talk about QA strategy moving forward, what each side needs and how do we deliver there. Also, QA leadership, push best practices, right? What should you be doing? What percentage of things, right? Why should you test this way? And finally, as you grow, right, this is where automation comes in, right? When you build your frameworks or you're maintaining frameworks, it shouldn't be, hey, my team is driving everything. Generally speaking, it's how do I work with developers to build these things? How do I fill in the blanks, right? Hey, developers are moving off this project, but we have some gaps. How do I update these gaps? And that's kind of where you should be thinking about. Other best practices, KPIs and OKRs. And I think this is super important for nascent QA organizations, right? Why are quality OKRs important? Well, one of the things you should be thinking about is, what are your KPIs? What are your quality key performance indicators, right? Once you capture these, you need to set goals saying, hey, this is what we're doing, where we're at. This is where I want us to be. And then you measure that and report it. And what this does is it forces engineering leadership to factor in feature quality and prioritize it, right? You're kind of building this quality culture by driving hard expectations in accountability. And what this means is, hey, if you tell your boss might be thinking, your VP engineer might be thinking, are we doing well? Are we doing not? How do I know? It feels like we haven't heard anything about any incidents recently. Bugs. No one's come knock on my door and say we have a lot of bugs. So I don't know. I have bigger fish to worry about. On the other hand, if you can go to him or her and say, look, here is how many defects are coming in versus this, right? Here is how many, root cause analysis that we caught, right? And it's gone up by 55%. And if we keep trending this way, major impact's going to happen, because every time a major impact happens, this number hits. That's quantifiable information that will force, leadership to make action and do something, right? So what KPIs do I like to use? I love the percent of defects types per root cause, right? This, like, how many, defects are bad code versus vendor versus bad config, versus regression. Each of these tell me a certain thing. Percent of defect types per incident and incident type, right? So how many severity 1s, 2s, 3s, 4, right? Open versus close. This gives me technical debt per each, severity. And then I love the accelerate top 4 KPIs. Even though these are DevOps, they really tell me a story of quality over my system, right? So my development frequency, my lead time for change, my mean time to remediate during incidents, and my change failure rate, which is every time I deploy, how many times do I have the hotfix, right? And even though this is more of a DevOpsy thing, I know that, hey, my validation is good, right? And my system is healthy. My change failure rate will be lower, which is good, right? Or, how confident that do I need more validation or less validation if, my mean time remediate is low, right? These are things that we can play with. That overall strategy, I can determine where I need more work versus where I need less work. I also like to look at partnership metrics, right? NPS is a good example. It's a very fuzzy metric. It's like, how happy am I with your product? But I can tie this with, my quality KPIs, metrics, and then I can use them together to say, look, customers aren't happy. We have higher bug defect rate here, and when we have low, the customers are happier. There is some correlation, right? So automation goals. Where or what should you be creating automation at the, at this stage, right? So I think the most important thing is a robust CI/CD. So at Iterable, all automation is tied into our pipeline, right? Builds get triggered automatically, tests get run automatically, right? And what this gives us is deployment orchestration, right? If a test fails, the deployment stops, right? Hard stop, right? And then we also have some flaky test detection, right? So we run it X amount of times. If it fails, we run it a few more times. And if it passes so many times, we know it's probably flaky. Then we move into quarantine, right? This does slow down our process, but then, it builds developer bandwidth, because, they're not always trying to, fix the build, right? We also do a lot of monitoring and testing to conduct rollback. And this gives me more faith in our system, right? If we deploy to a canary stage and we detect a failure there, or we see like a lot of 500 suddenly, we'll automatically roll back, and that buys me time. We also look at different environments, right? Your staging environment, our staging environment is terrible. It's just unreliable. There's just too much, our customer data is just too varied for our synthetic data. So we test a lot in Canary, which is our production, right? We use feature flags to push code out. And usually our Canary sits on a different Elasticsearch instance. So the backend's a little bit different. And we also do some monitoring production. But having different environments allows us to have more confidence in our deployment and more confidence in our testing. What else? Automation goals. I like to say, what else beyond end to end, right? A good QA team has a balance of tools. Now, when we talk about tools, what shouldn't QA be doing? I never want my engineers to own unit testing or integration testing. And it blows my mind when I talk to some companies and they're like, yeah, our QA write unit test. Because where's your ownership? Where's your developer ownership, right? How are they owning QA? And if they, if you let them get away with this, then they don't own their own code quality, which is terrible. On the other hand, things like contract testing, right? PACT, QA kind of jumps in and kind of helps along with that, right? PACT is basically, Optimizely was moving to more of a self-contained service, right? So as you move each service individually to deployment, you want to make sure they don't break things downstream or upstream. So QA kind of built, a contract service where you can store your PACT test, and then the consumer, as you deploy a consumer provider service, it communicates with that, contract service and validates it hasn't broken anything downstream or upstream. We also, partner API testing, right? For example, we maintain Postman, right? It's nice to have some collections written, easy to share with less technical teams. Your in-house built API testing, Postman does not do everything. And, while it's great, I don't think it's encompassing enough, right? So we also built, our off testing, synthetic payloads, sanitized payloads, response validation, etc. Other things that are nice, for example, is like Dread. It's a tool that validates API description documents against backend implementation. So we partner with this, right? So maybe a developer might stand it up, but we'll contribute to it. So how do we scale to enterprise level, right? Process and checklist, right? Apple's famous for this. They do not want teams to guess at what to do, right? Maturity means clear process from how you release from beginning to end, right? People should know who's responsible and what needs to be looped in before code goes live. This is how you maintain quality. QA leadership is super important, right? What is the role of QA in your organization? How do you strategize on hiring roles, determining how to work with engineering and what programs you'll move forward? And with this, allow you to drive your QA roadmap, right? What should your team be working on in conjunction with engineering, right? What internal tooling should you be pushing? How will you staff this? Is it a build versus buy? How do you champion this? All right, we're nearing the end. Public companies, we can't mess this up, right? These are companies that went IPO. So I'll go through this quickly. I worked at two companies, CareFusion, which is huge. It was a medical device company, spun out from Cardinal Health, and it was acquired in BED for $12.2 billion. WebSense had a lot of employees, founded in 1994. It was a platform to manage collection of security products. WebSense is interesting. It went public, delisted, got acquired by a private equity, got sold, went public again, and then got acquired and then delisted. Both of these companies had hundreds of engineers and QA teams ranging from 50 to 100, right? But the problem with these companies is they were very like old school. They had a lot of manual QA. They had some automation, but they were very separate, right? They had an automation QA team and they had a lot of manual testers. And that is the testing challenge for QA. How do you get value from your QA, right? Is your QA driving value versus cost of employees? How do you modernize your QA team, right? With these big companies, with these engineers that have been there for a long, long time, they're kind of stuck on, well, what's the best practice? Well, this was working, so why should we go move to the newer system, right? A lot of these companies have been around for a long time, and they're using older systems, and they're less likely to want to move to, what's going on, what's the new thing? How do we kind of move forward? That investment is very expensive, right? So how do you invest in up-leveling your individual engineers, right? How do you juggle development priorities with QA priorities? How do you champion modern QA principles? And even measuring success of your engineering team is very difficult, right? You need to answer process questions. Did I build the right product? Testing answers, right? Did I build the product right? Metrics, how do we perform against industry standards? And I think this is the biggest tool. If you can push, how are we doing versus how the best performers are, generally that's how you get attention. So best practice considerations, more trade-offs, right? The manual QA tester problem. This is one of the things that I see the biggest at these big companies, right? Where do they fit, right? Should you train them? Should you transition them to like more of a technical program manager, right? And then the problem is we see this like huge shift for like, hey, let's move shift left, right? Let's get rid of all QA. Developers will create money into orchestration for CI/CD. Developers write tests. And what this misses and what this hurts you is your developers, your DevOps don't have this QA acumen, right? They're thinking of developing, they're not thinking about testing, not about customer empathy, right? So you need a balanced QA acumen with technical strength, right? So a lot of companies now I see, for example, like Amazon, they're mixed hiring, right? They have a QA analyst and they pair them with a SDET automation engineer, right? You need to kind of drive this culture of developers doing internal tooling with QA leadership, right? Because QA kind of tells them what to build against versus what they're building, right? And that kind of works really well too. Or you can punt. If you're not a great, if your company isn't super technical and you're not into like engineering, and it costs so much to have QA just doing manual testing, why don't you outsource to a vendor, right? Teslio and Rainforest are two of the biggest companies I see, and they, for cheaper than hiring people, they'll, the product manager comes in, learns your product, and then they have their own testers crowdsourced to test, your product, and that could be, a trade-off. For your automation goals, I look at two of the biggest companies out there doing this really well, right? And I look at two examples. One's shift left and one's shift right. If you want to do automation, shift left is continuous delivery at scale, right? So for example, Facebook pushes 10 to 100 code changes every few hours. Their new hires are expected to push code almost day one. Changes are small and incremental. Deployment is tiered in case of a problem. So they push to their employees first, then they roll out to 2%, and they roll out to 100%. So they monitor and test at each stage to make sure everything works well, right? The benefits of this is it's rare to need a hotfix. Code is constantly coming out, constantly, right? And there's a high focus on internal tooling and automation, right? You need to have this to be able to do it, and you can trust it. And there's quick turnaround with feedback. So you see Facebook shifts a lot of their testing to the left side, and then they shift upwards, right? And they're constantly moving, which is, you get rapid feedback. Now, what about shift right? Automation on the right side is testing production, right? In this case, testing environment matters, right? And we see this because, your staging can be completely useless, right? Production data as you move to enterprise may be way more complex. And when you're enterprise, testing is so much harder because it's no longer, you're really good now, obviously, at making sure things are working. But what kills you is the edge cases. And how do you catch those edge cases? You're not going to catch them in staging, right? You have to kind of look for them in production, right? So how do you test in production, right? You need to deal with PI, replayability, right? Because if you scrape your customer data, put it into a test account, you're going to clash in your backend, right? So, Netflix uses the concept of test environment to replay their data for testing into this environment so the backend doesn't clash. On the other hand, things that don't need data, they can run in production to validate that it works. Cool. So scaling for the future, right? Investment. Companies that are on the forefront usually have amazing tools and teams to do them, right? So this takes a lot of money. Keep learning, right? You need to make sure your teams are constantly learning and trying new things. What was best practice standards easily becomes outdated in a few years, and suddenly your team that was good is now technical debt. And finally, punt. And I say this to a lot of companies I talk to, like, you're not an engineering company with tons of talent and research. Why are you going to build yourself into a hole, right? Go outsource to a vendor and do what you're good at instead. So, either punt to a third-party vendor or use a third-party tool, right? A lot of vendors now are, such as Cloudbeat or Cypress, very powerful, right? Why would you build them yourself? All right. So what are the takeaways from today's talk? Reframe winning, right? Success looks completely different for different companies at different sizes, right? Understand what you're trying to do and make sure you win at that. What got you here won't get you there, right? Your automation strategy and way of doing things will need to change with time. Don't be scared to make that change. Culture skills, right? This is super important, right? The earlier you establish a culture of quality first will last you from seed to enterprise. Process can guide you, right? One of the best ways to help your team scale is remove the ambiguity for implementation and focus on the engineering. Be the QA champion, right? Present leadership with return of investment, right? What are things working, what's not? Create cross-functional partnerships across teams and empower your engineers to do the best they can. And play to your strengths, right? There's always more than one way to succeed. You need to be aware how to frame this. And with that being said, that's the end of my talk. Ron, I think I went a little bit over. I apologize, but I would love to stay in touch. Here's my email and here's my LinkedIn. And with that, I'm going to stop my share and turn this back to Ron. Aaron, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you so much, Jeff. It was really amazing hearing with you. Yeah, you can unmute yourself. I want to maybe give you an opportunity to answer some questions that might occur. People, feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A, and we can take another 2 or 3 minutes to answering questions if we need. Yeah, I think there is a question. Do you see the questions, Jeff, or do you need me to read
I can see the questions. Let's see. I can start with Iterable. Is not a Python inspired name. Iterable actually. Well, the true story, it was the founders were trying to pick a name, and originally the name they wanted to go with the founder wanted to go with Measure, and the other founder was like, no, we're not doing Measure. And they looked at Measure.com, and it was super expensive. So they looked around to see, well, what can we name that kind of means measure or improve on, that's cheap to buy because they're really poor. And they found that the domain iterable.com was only like $400. And they're like, we can afford $400. And that is why we're called Iterable 7 years later. So that's why we're Iterable. Heather had a question, so I'll read it out loud. So at my organization, we struggle to get to understand how the code is developed, which would drive our strategy and approach. What is your approach for getting this cultural mindset to change? So this is a really good question, actually. I think the most important thing to understand is, this concept of your developer is building code, but you need to understand, did they build the code right? That's testing, but do they even build the right product? And that is, in order to do that, you have to understand even before they start coding what they're doing. So we talk to product and we request them to give us a product requirement document, or at least something that says, why are we building this? What does the customer want, right? What is the goal of this feature and what are we trying to do? And then we talk to the teams that are building the code, so the developers. Well, what are you building? Why are you building this, right? And we try to tie them together into what we call acceptance criteria. And this is part of our test planning, right? So what we say is, here's what product wanted, here's our customer use case, here's how the developers did it, right? How do we validate they actually accomplished this, right? And then we build our test off that. So at the end of the release, if the test pass, we know that we've matched what the requirements are with what the developers said they were going to build, and it's good to go. If the tests fail, we can easily say, well, you didn't actually build correctly what you wanted to do. So that's a really high level, right? Now, low level, right? What we do is we can pair with developers. If an engineer wants to say, hey, walk me through what you're checking in through each handoff, show me why you did this, what the technology behind it is, right? If you're writing an API, where are you sourcing it? Where is it getting a back end, right? And we can kind of document this. That's, in some sense, I feel like almost too low level. I don't know if every engineer needs that, right? I more care about what product wanted us to build and how you plan to meet it, and did you actually do it? Does that kind of answer your question, Heather?
Another question here from Pini. How to test case and test plan fit in? Are they dead since QA shifting left?
Great question, Pini. And the answer is absolutely not. But caveat, depends, right? And this kind of goes back to my talk, right? Where are you in the organization, right? If you're in a small organization like ours, then yes, your test cases and test plans, you don't really have time, right? You're shipping fast, you're moving really quickly. But your test plans may look different. So my example is, we don't do test cases here because both at Iterable, Optimizely, and Elevation, and all the small companies I've been at, we're moving too fast. It doesn't make sense to sit and write 50 test cases when you're already shipping out the door. But we do have a test plan because we need to understand how we're going to test, right? Developers can't just release in a vacuum, right? So how are they going to, what considerations do they need to think about before they code? And even if we shift left, right? So for example, performance testing, what is our SLA? How do we prove that, right? That needs to get done, even if we're constantly shipping it out, right? It may be we do this before we flip the switch later, in production, right? It could be out there, but we still have to test it. So our test plan kind of sits down the teams to say, hey, you need to do these things before we release. And before we turn that switch, either a feature flag or we deploy the cluster, right? Did we do these things? Now, as you move more and more to the right, and you're these bigger companies, right, where you have people who have time, you're a little slower to development, right? Test cases do make sense, right? And the reason why is you potentially could say like, you're going to get audited. Did you test? How did you prove that you actually did something? And those test cases will come back and say, we did our job. We actually validated these things are working. So we can't get sued. And you'll see different industries require those things, right? So there is a case to say test cases do matter, test plans do matter. They just look differently at different stages in different companies.
Wonderful, wonderful. I have my own question, and I think we'll wrap it up unless, of course, anyone has any other question. But we're a bit over our time. But I just have to ask this question. You were mentioning, of course, different groups of QA, and it was really amazing. Firstly, I really enjoyed this conversation. One of the things that I was wondering about is how would you define the profile, the proficiency of a QA person in each of those stages? Are there different people? Could they be the same person in each of the stages, or do they have different profiling?
Yes, they do. And that's a great question. Obviously, in your seed stage, you don't have QA, so it's probably your founder.
Right.
Your A, Bs, generally it's your staff engineer or your engineers. They all have to kind of, do QA, right? One of my favorite stories is there's a small company, I won't name, and no one did QA, and every build for a month failed and the customer churned. So the VP engineering says, congratulations, we just hired, there's 30 of us in a room, you're all QA. Before every release, everyone has to manual test everything. So for one Friday before release, everyone has to sit there and all day they manual test, right? And that's terrible, but that really happened, right? So there is no QA, small companies. Big companies though, I see the first QA tends to be, someone who's both very technical, but knows QA principles, right? And their job is to drive best practices in terms of how we automate, why we automate, and how do we build processes in, and how do we tag these KPIs, and how do we kind of get our developers to do the right thing. This role, usually when they hire for this role, it's almost like, we want you to code. But when you get there, they're like, we don't want you to code, because we only have one of you, and we need you to be in these meetings to say the right things, to get the right things, to get the people to do the right things, right? As you grow though, they generally want to hire, technical engineers that can do some of the process, right? So that's kind of where I see it starts to change. And then as you get bigger and bigger, they'll hire more traditional QAs, people who have a lot of QA experience, and know some coding, in some companies, they'll hire a lot of analysts, maybe short-term analysts, to do manual testing for a big project, right? But generally your first hire is always someone that, very, very technical.
I see. There's a question here from Israel, Israel the country and Israel the person. How would approach something which is infra, like for example, a product is a DB? I'm not sure I understand the question. Let me just try and interpret it, and maybe Israel, if you can just type it again, just make it more clear, or you can even type it in Hebrew and I'll translate. I think it means, you figure it out. I think it's something about, testing infrastructure maybe, or testing aspects of infrastructure in production. But let's give Israel another chance just to type it in, or just type it in Hebrew if you want, and I'll translate. Any other questions? Okay, we'll give Israel another half a minute to answer. In the meantime, I added my email in the chat. So anyone wanting to approach us, me in general, maybe giving us ideas for our next webinars, or just talking shop, anything you want, just feel free to contact me. My email is here. It's aron.damlin@cloudbeat.io. You're more than welcome to actually contact us. We're also available in LinkedIn and in Twitter, Cloudbeat, and you can have a look at it. It's Cloudbeat with a B-E-A-T, not bit. Some of the people do that mistake, so make that mistake. Okay, I don't think Israel is retyping, so we're going to skip that question. Sorry about that, Israel. I just don't really understand what I've said. But having said that, I just want to thank all of you for staying. It was amazing. Jeff, I think it was the first time I've listened that a webinar starts with a certain number of people, and finishes with more people than it started with. So that's amazing. So good kudos for that. And cheers, and really, really interesting conversation. And I'm really looking forward to seeing more lectures in your that you have. Certainly, if you have any, I'll probably love to share them with our viewers. Any final words?
No, thank you so much for having me, Aaron. I really appreciate it and love to see what Cloudbeat's doing. Really happy for you guys. Looks great. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, this ends our webinar for today, tonight, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us. Keep posted on other webinars that we'll be publishing. We usually have one every several months. We don't. We want to work on quality, so we're really looking for those special people that we can really interview and have their conversation. So we have it, let's say, once every month or two. So really feel free to join and follow us in our social media, and we'll be sure to publish them. Thank you so much. And again, for everyone, thank you, Jeff. Have a nice evening. See you. Bye-bye.